wars are often remembered for their battles, victories, and losses. But there are days that transcend battles into becoming symbols of unimaginable suffering, chaos, and the collapse of humanity itself. In Vietnam, a nation torn asunder by decades of war, the supreme day of tragedy is still yet to be challenged. It was on March 16, 1968, that the village of My Lai would be forever scarred, not as a battlefield, but as a massacre site. A day when soldiers turned their weapons on unarmed civilians, and the moral compass of humanity seemed to falter. It was a moment not only that would change the course of the war in Vietnam, but also reshape how the world perceived the atrocities of modern warfare. This was not just another grim statistic of war, but a pointer to the lowest levels of degradation that humanity can plunge into when fear, anger, and hate are in the driver's seat. Let me now try to bring into perspective what happened on that day in its full magnitude by briefly explaining the background of the Vietnam War. The war was, from 1955 to 1975, far more than a conflict between North and South Vietnam. Rather, it was a global proxy war, stirred up by the Cold War, which was basically a clash of ideologies between communism and democracy. Thus, intervention in Vietnam by the United States came with the belief that containment of communism in Southeast Asia was a matter dealing with the security of the nation. To many policymakers, Vietnam was one of those dominoes that could not be allowed to fall. But on the ground, to the soldiers fighting in the jungles and the villagers of rural hamlets, it was not about politics or ideologies. It was an ongoing fight for survival. The violence, displacement, and destruction caused by war had been relentless, with no apparent end in sight for those caught up in it. The war's guerrilla tactics blurred the line between combatant and civilian. The Viet Cong was a communist-led force that moved unobtrusively among villagers, planting traps, setting ambushes, and melting into the jungle. Most of the local communities supported and supplied them, most out of necessity, but also under threat of violence. For U.S. troops, this created an environment of constant fear and paranoia. Every villager could be a potential enemy, every rice paddy concealing a deadly trap. This complete confusion made it impossible to define friend and foe, and in time, this distrust fostered resentment. The frustration of the soldiers who were never able to engage a visible enemy far too often took its rage out on the very people they were there to protect. The tension and distrust formed the base on which the terrible events that occurred in My Lai were founded. March 16, 1968, dawned much like every other day in the small hamlet of My Lai. The village, nestled in Quang Ngai province, was home to farmers, women, children, and elderly men people quite far from the global political stage. It was a tranquil community, one that had kept a semblance of normalcy amidst the war. As the sun rose, villagers were already up tending to their daily chores of food preparation, field tending, and taking care of the family. Children played in the dirt, laughing and running around noisily. Life was normal for them, with no idea something was amiss. But Charlie Company of the U.S. Army's 11th Infantry Brigade had some other intentions concerning the hamlet. They were armed, angry, and under orders that would initiate one of the darkest days in modern history. Charlie Company had been on edge for weeks. They had lost comrades to hidden traps and ambushes, fighting an elusive enemy who struck without warning and melted away into the dense jungle. These experiences bred frustration, anger, and fear. To the soldiers, it was a fight daily for survival and sanity. The psychological wear and tear of unending uncertainty and the gruesome reality of jungle warfare had pushed many of them to the brink. The soldiers had been briefed that My Lai was a Viet Cong stronghold, a haven for enemy fighters, and that they should destroy the village and leave nothing behind. This belief, along with months of combat stress, would drive them to commit one of the most horrific atrocities of the Vietnam War. What the soldiers entered in My Lai was not a stronghold of the Viet Cong. There were no fighters, no weapons, no semblance of resistance. What they found were unarmed civilians, women cooking, children playing in the dirt, and elderly men tending to their livestock. Instead, a massacre was let loose by these soldiers. Whatever happened in subsequent hours was not less than the very definition of pure terror, since it expressed and unleashed the frustrating frights of frustrated soldiers on non-armed persons who had nothing at their disposal to even raise a leg or hand. The violence began without warning, innocent villagers being rounded up en masse, placed into ditches, and slaughtered. More than 500 had their lives taken away that day. Women were also raped brutally before being killed. Children were shot while hanging on to their parents' apparel. Whole families were annihilated in a question of seconds. The violence was just unimaginable. The soldiers went from door to door, pulling people out of their homes and killing them without scruples. Survivors later remembered the nightmare, the screams of their nearest and dearest, the unceasing noise of gunfire, the unbearable spectacle of bodies falling in ditches. The killings were done in the most inhumane ways. Survivors remember soldiers laughing and jeering while killing. One man, hiding in a ditch, remembered the relentless gunfire that turned the bodies of his family members into lifeless shields. One of the survivors testified to the voices of a mother begging for mercy for her child's sake. And then there was the stopping of that voice by one shot. The cruelty of the day had no boundaries. This was not a few stray soldiers acting on their own initiative. It was collective and organized mass murder, conducted under the cover of a military operation. Homes were torched, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered. It was burned to ashes and the people vanished. The survivors remember that day as something endless, with smelly burnt houses, with uninterrupted shots on and on, the bodies of loved ones laying dead lifeless in fields. A mother threw her body on an infant, and she was shot, but under her dead body, the baby survived along all the scars. These physical scars are also there forever, where this once lively village that hummed with human voices should now resemble some kind of ghostly cemetery. Not all soldiers in Charlie Company went willingly. Some refused to fire their weapons. Others protested, horrified by what they were witnessing. But their voices were drowned out by the chaos. It wasn't until one man, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, took a stand that the massacre began to subside. Thompson, a helicopter pilot, had been flying overhead when he saw the carnage below. Horrified by what he witnessed, he made the bold decision to intervene. Flying over the carnage in his helicopter, Thompson was horrified by what he saw below. He landed his aircraft between the soldiers and a group of terrified villagers, ordering his crew to protect the civilians. Thompson even threatened to open fire on the soldiers if they continued the killing. His actions, which saved dozens of lives, would later be recognized as acts of extraordinary courage. But at the time, Thompson received much hostility from his colleagues for speaking up against the activities of Talayer. His acts of bravery were not able to undo the horror that had been committed. For the hundreds who had lost their lives, Thompson's intervention came too late. It wasn't enough that a massacre had occurred. What followed was an attempt to bury the truth deep. Military reports portrayed the operation as a success, that more than 100 VC fighters had been killed. There was no mention of civilian casualties. Layers of bureaucracy and deliberate lying kept the truth hidden for months. The story, however, was finally to break in 1969, when the tenacious investigative journalist Seymour Hersh finally told the world about it. Accompanying this explosive report was shocking photography from Army photographer Ron Haberle, showing bodies piled in ditches, lifeless children, and haunting faces of survivors. These images, along with survivor testimonies, forced the world to stop and confront a reality that became horrifically alive from an otherwise faraway place called the Vietnam War. These acts additionally caused outrage and unbelievable reactions among the public. My Lai, to many Americans, symbolized what was worst about the war. It busted everything regarding heroism and exposed, even better, the ethical decay that comes through a no-way-out fog of war. This made anti-war protests explode in cities nationwide among students, veterans, and others, demanding America unhand the war. The massacre became a rallying cry for the growing anti-war movement, further eroding support for the U.S. presence in Vietnam. When the truth of My Lai came to light, the world demanded accountability. Lieutenant William Calley, the officer who led the massacre, became the face of the atrocity. He was court-martialed and found guilty of murdering 22 villagers. But his punishment was shockingly light. Sentenced to life in prison, Calley served only 3.5 years under house arrest. Most of the soldiers involved faced absolutely no consequences at all. For the survivors of My Lai, this lack of justice was a bitter reminder of how easily their suffering could be dismissed. The massacre had far-reaching consequences, both in Vietnam and around the world. It forced the U.S. military to rethink its rules of engagement and its strategy of counterinsurgency. It also marked a turning point in public opinion, galvanizing demands to end the war. College campuses exploded with protests, students carrying signs that read, "Remember My Lai" and "Stop the Killing." Veterans of the conflict in Vietnam joined in the protests, threw away their medals, and spoke about atrocities they had committed or witnessed. For the people of My Lai, the scars of that day would never fully heal. But amidst such devastation, the survivors refused to let their story be forgotten. Over the years that followed, they rebuilt their village and constructed a memorial to the victims. Today, My Lai serves as a place of remembrance and a warning. Artifacts from the village are on view, as well as first-hand accounts and graves of the victims where visitors can pay their respects. The survivors of My Lai became ambassadors of peace, telling the world of the atrocities committed so that such an act would never happen again. This is a statement to the resilience of the human spirit, which even on the darkest day will survive. Their tragedy has been molded into a message of hope and humanity through education and remembrance. The tragedy of My Lai also left an indelible mark on the soldiers who participated in it. Many came back home, haunted by guilt and trauma, struggling to come to terms with their actions in relation to their humanity. Some spoke out later in life, hoping to atone for their involvement. Their testimonies serve as a stark reminder of the psychological toll of war, not just on its victims, but on its perpetrators too. The My Lai massacre remains a cautionary tale more than 50 years later. It is a stark reminder of what happens when fear and hatred override compassion and morality. It is a lesson in accountability, the need to uphold ethical standards, even in the chaos of war and the dangers of dehumanizing an enemy. The story of My Lai is not an easy one to hear, but it is one we must confront, because in remembering the darkest days of our past, we can strive to build a brighter future, one in which such tragedies are never repeated. As we remember the victims and the survivors, let us carry on with the lessons of My Lai. Every life is precious, accountability matters, and even in war, humanity must prevail.